Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello, Robyn. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm joined today with Robyn Mourning, and she's a trauma therapist. Please tell us about yourself and about your work and what you do.
Yeah, well, I'm really happy to be on the show and finally getting to chat with you and all of your amazing listeners. As you said, I'm a trauma therapist, and my office is in like a northern suburb of Denver, Colorado, about 20 minutes outside of Denver. And I primarily work with individuals and families, and I do some group therapy as well, but people who are recovering from all kinds of relationship trauma. So that could look like, childhood abuse or neglect, any sort of sexual trauma at any age, and people who have experienced like domestic violence or intimate partner abuse, and how all of that can intersect with cultural trauma, especially for people of color and people who are in the LGBTQ community and all kinds of other things that are when our identities kind of collide, the intersection of life.
Right.
That's where I concentrate a lot of my work as well, because all of us have all kinds of different identities that we carry with us, and how that interacts in our social world impacts, how everything else interplays. So, yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about what drives the passion behind your work?
Yeah, I've felt that I was, my purpose was kind of, as I say with most people, is to be a sister on the path of healing. And it turns out that right now I am a therapist doing that work. I have my own experiences of trauma and in lots of different forms. And so I know what it's like to go through that. And my story is different from everybody else's story. But I think when we talk about having experiences of abuse or violence or assault and relationships that are toxic, I think a lot of us have similar experiences in terms of how that impacts us and how hard it is to get through that, but then how empowering it is to be on the other side, whatever the other side looks like, but to be on the other side and be able to walk with others who are kind of behind and alongside and be there to support and inspire and motivate. And so that's really my passion, and I believe that freedom from that trauma is possible, and everybody gets to decide what that freedom looks like. So
I see.
Why do what I do.
Yes, that's awesome. And you and I had specifically connected on social media about racial trauma.
Yeah, we did.
Can you explain for our listeners who may not know what racial trauma is and why that is such a relative topic that needs discussion?
Yeah, I think it's something that a lot of people are talking more about over the last few years, which is great. And I also think it's highlighting the gaps. People don't really understand what that means. What does it mean to have trauma because of your experiences based on the color of your skin? And if our society is going to be the way it is, how do you get better? How do you deal with that trauma, and how do you recover and essentially not be affected by it all the time? And it's a very complex, I think it's a very complex experience for most of us. I am a woman of color, and so I know what it's been like for me. But when I think of cultural trauma or race-based trauma, I think of it on the individual level, but also on the community level, the group level, because it is not just the experience of the individual, and much of how the individual person is going to respond to any sort of racial slurs or bigotry or racism in their life will depend on how their families talk about it, how the communities within which they grew up in talk about it or deal with it or don't deal with it and talk about it. And so it's very much influenced by community. And when you think about cultural trauma, the definition is really based in the group experience of what happened. And so when I think of race-based trauma, I think of any of the stress, the fear, the anxieties, the ways that we navigate the world, right? Our rules and rituals around when we go out into public, when we go to school, when we go to work, to the grocery store. What are all the things that we are carrying with us in our minds and in our hearts and our emotions as we navigate that world, knowing that we are either, among other people who look like us and we're all carrying that stress and the weight of that, or we kind of feel isolated and alone and no one else looks like us. And so we're on the defense or we're prepared for some sort of, racist comment or assault, whether it be intentional, unintentional, or, anywhere in between that. So
where, it's, I think race-based trauma, as you said, is a topic that's talked about now. That I actually think it extends, to way back when. Yes. And so if you had to tell your clients, the listeners, where does it come from? How do you think it's evolved into this thing where it is now?
That's a really good question, because I can speak from my experience as an African American woman who is also biracial. So my experience is that, from what I know in my family, what stories I've been told, and just what I know in reading history and literature, and just all the people around me, at least for African American individuals, Black people, I think it stems from slavery in America, and probably a little bit before that as well, and how African Americans have been systemically and institutionally dehumanized over, several generations. And I think that creates a level of trauma within Black people now, is that, that they are not seen as human in the same way as a white person is, in the same way that a Latino is. I mean, it's true. It's just a different experience. And I think, anyone of color is going to have their own definition of, or their own idea of how this started. But I think for African Americans, it is, when slavery was really running rampant. And I don't know that I can't say that it's over. I know that's a hot topic and a controversial thing to say. But I think that's really where it stems from. Black people were dehumanized and treated as subhuman, and so therefore we were subjected to anything, and we didn't have any rights, and we didn't have a right to protect ourselves or to create any sort of life for ourselves. And a lot of individuals still feel the same way, that stuff is still happening.
And there's a lot of people that would say, slavery was X, Y, and Z years ago for African Americans in America. And there's that popular question that comes up, and it's like a hot button question, but people continue to ask it or say it. Why can't we just get over it?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I know for me and what I've seen, I can get over something if it's over. And what does that even mean? Get over it, right? Like I can move forward from something, um, and let it be in the past when I'm done working through that. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard for a lot of people of color to leave their experiences of racism in the past and grow from them and, evolve and all of that when it's done. And it seems like it's not done. It's never been completed here in America. There are still a lot of people experiencing racism and discrimination based on the color of their skin or their kind of origin, their family heritage. And so it's not something we can really get over when we're still kind of in the middle of it.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so, and along with that, there's also, there's different levels of racism, right? We talk about microaggressions as well as macroaggressions. Are you able to talk a little bit about those things and what they are and how they're experienced?
Mm-hmm. So a microaggression can be something that is, a comment or a joke that's not directly or explicitly meant to, assault someone based on the color of their skin. And it can be something that people are unaware of. The person saying it or doing it is not maybe intentionally saying, well, I'm going to make a racist comment right now. They could just be really unaware or tone deaf to the situation, or just, they don't get it. Or they do and we make a mistake, or no one is perfect. And so an example of a microaggression can be, let's say, I'm from a Spanish speaking country, or, that's my family heritage. And someone may ask, well, you speak Spanish, right? Like you must, because you're, you must, you have to. Why don't you speak Spanish? What's wrong with you? Comments like that can be very insulting for that person, because just because they have, maybe they're from Mexico or something, just because they are, doesn't mean that they are a Spanish speaker. And there's a lot of assumptions and there's a lot of unspoken expectations that people put on one another when they ask those sorts of questions or make those statements. And it's kind of like a paper cut. It's not going to be it may not be as painful or as impactful as, some other sort of statement, like a macroaggression that we'll talk about, but it can cause pain, and it can cause the person to feel singled out based on the color of their skin or their heritage. And so a microaggression is not always going to be something that is generalized to everybody. They're very personal, and we may not know that what we're saying is racist or is hurtful, because it's going to be different for everybody. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why a lot of people feel that they have to walk on eggshells, which, I don't expect anyone to walk on eggshells with me, but making comments to me like, oh, you look so exotic, right? What are you? You're so exotic looking. Wow. It makes me feel like I'm a rare parrot or something, I'm a person, right? And I know they're trying to be kind and, compliment me, I guess. And they just don't know how to do it. And they don't get it. And that's okay. And I can say, well, it's my, if I want to, I can say, well, actually saying it like that is a little bit offensive. And, I can choose to say after whatever I want to say after that. So that can be an example of a microaggression, and it is different. It can't be different for everybody. Just because that, I consider that a microaggression doesn't mean somebody else would. Okay. Yeah. But okay. Some of them are kind of general, right? Like, yep, everyone could agree, like that is a microaggression. Yes. So asking someone, what are you, could probably offend, 99% of people of color that you ask that question to.
Right. And then there's also macroaggression, right? There's aggression on a much bigger level. Mm-hmm. Are you able to talk about that at all with our listeners?
Absolutely. Those are examples where it can be very overt violence or aggression towards a person, and it's very obvious. It's very clear that the person inflicting it is doing so because of the color of the person's skin. Right? And they're very, it can be like a hate crime that we hear about. It can be someone who is bullied or attacked physically or verbally by somebody because of the color of their skin. And it's very clear, right? They may call them racial slurs. They may spit on them and, say, make really awful comments about that. It can be, all the police brutality cases that we see against men of color, specifically Black men. Like, those are examples. Also, I don't know if you're going to ask this, but I just thought of it. When we think about racism as being like institutionalized, right? Like our institutions, our governments, our systems, they are kind of at this point, like they're just very innately racist. And so I don't know, sometimes that feels like it is like a microaggression, but then other times it feels like a macroaggression, right? There are people who are not even allowed to buy houses, until the 1990s. They couldn't even buy a house. People from Asian countries couldn't even buy a house here in certain areas until, the 90s. And so that to me is very like macro. Like, that is a big deal and very in your face to those people. And so I think those threads, of institutionalized racism kind of run the full gamut.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
Very much so. Do you think one is more detrimental than the other?
No, I think they're both equally as harmful, because someone who experiences a microaggression doesn't just experience one in their lifetime, right? Like, you get a single paper cut, you'll probably be okay, right? Just wash it and you'll be fine, right? So someone makes one single comment to you that feels like that is a microaggression, you might be able, you'll heal from it, right? Move on and and be okay. But it doesn't happen that you just have one experience of a microaggression in your life. And because, if in America, people of color are still technically the minority. And so, it's a very unsure and unstable, like, people walk around and like, am I going to be okay? Am I safe here? Is someone going to say something? And so just that awareness alone can increase stress, can decrease a person's sense of belonging, and can really inhibit someone from feeling like they're able to thrive in their community. Not everybody is going to feel that way, but a lot of people experience that and they can't really kind of let their guard down. And so even if someone never experienced a macroaggression, right, they were never, explicitly bullied or physically harmed or something like that, maybe they experienced a lifetime of microaggressions and they're carrying the weight of that, and it can very much increase, depression and anxiety and addiction and all kinds of things. And so that's a similar question to me as, what's more harmful, emotional abuse or physical abuse?
Right.
To me, they're both extremely harmful and impactful on a person's life.
Yeah. Okay. And as you know, I specialize in working with victims of narcissistic abuse.
Yeah.
And for me, I would consider racism or, racial aggression or race-based trauma a form of narcissistic abuse. Would you say that society is narcissistic when it comes to issues about race? Race-based trauma.
Yeah, I'm getting right in there with the controversy, huh? I love it. I think my answer is yes and no. I definitely think they're, the extremist mentality, or like people who are very, very extreme, very, very racist, very extreme in their expression of their racism. I think that can be a function of narcissism, and some sort of, unhealthy pattern or unhealthy personality traits and stuff. So in that sense, yes. And then I think there are people who are also very unaware and uneducated, or they have experienced, they're told by their family and their community certain things, and they may not fully understand it, and they just kind of go along with it. And it's just what they know, right? Like you grew up thinking the sky is blue, but what if you found out actually the sky is not blue, right? And you just were like, well, I just went along with it. I never thought about it twice. Like I never questioned it. I don't know that I can say that person is necessarily narcissistic. I think it would depend on a lot. I'd need to know a lot more about that person. But I do think, like, as a whole, as I'm reading and, taking the temperature of social media posts and all the communications that we engage in online, and we're seeing in our leadership, I would say on that level as a whole, people are really afraid to let go of their paradigms. And, as it relates to what they view, their worldview on, race and what equality and justice looks like. And so for some, I think that can look like narcissism, right? They only want to protect themselves, and their own comfort level and the schemas they have in their own mind of what this looks like, right? Race relations or social justice. And I think it can be on both sides, honestly. We all get very protective. So sometimes I think it can be a function of narcissism. Absolutely, for sure. And I know there's a lot of conversation around, do we actually put this in, the DSM, the mental health, Bible, essentially, as a mental health disorder? Is racism or being racist some sort of mental health disorder? And, I don't know. I think sometimes I want to answer yes, based on what I know, all the knowledge that I have and the research and the information I gather from other people. I can see in a lot of ways, yes. And it can also be a function, like a secondary issue. A lot of people who are extreme in their expression of racism were kind of groomed and grown up in it, right? They grew up, and some people, I've listened to some stories of like former KKK members and stuff, and how they grew up being groomed to think horrible things, and they watched horribly violent videos, and they were exposed to a level of violence that no kid should be exposed to. So I do also think that it can be a trauma response, right? There can be a lot of PTSD involved, a lot of just a lot of issues around that. And so to say, narcissism can evolve into that, absolutely. And I think it can be very complex. I don't think that somebody who is that extreme in their racist views and expression, I can't say that they are, like, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that they're completely, mentally and emotionally and relationally healthy, in my view or my definition of what healthy would look like, and knowing that is very a wide spectrum. But I don't know. I don't know that I can say that.
No. And And one thing that comes to mind is, for me, is the thing that you mentioned earlier on, where, our standard of beauty, where you said someone made the comment to you that you look very exotic.
Right.
And being that you don't have one feature one way or the other, having an exotic feature is considered a standard of beauty. And when you look at, and I'm thinking more along the lines of makeup commercials, your typical Vogue or Harper's Bazaar magazine, and a standard of beauty. And traditionally, people of color were not considered to be beautiful. They're considered to be ethnic or exotic looking, and that type of, in your traditional look, has a slender, white female that has a certain look. in that still cater to, even today there are certain places that don't use people of color and use a wide spectrum of women of color, women of all different shapes and sizes. So just looking at the standard of beauty or being told what we should look like, or the concept of vulturism is another thing that I'm thinking of, where like if I were to wear cornrows, it'd be, she's so ghetto. But then when Kim Kardashian does it, oh, she's beautiful, she's setting a trend, she's doing something that's never been done before, her fashion statement is fierce.
I know, it's ridiculous. Yeah, it is really ridiculous. And then you get comments like, wow, she's really beautiful for a Black woman.
Yeah.
I've never seen an Asian man look so dreamy, right? Like, okay, right, like we're not allowed, like we've never been, because we've been dehumanized, right? So we're not culturally and historically beautiful, just like a white person is beautiful, and it ends there, right? It's just beautiful person, well, very attractive, right? But you're right. And then being, when we express our culture and what it looks like in terms of what we wear and how we have our hair and all of that. It's, there's rules around what people of color are allowed to do.
Yes.
And when you do certain things, right? Oh, you're ghetto. Or, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so, and it comes back to your question of when people say like, well, you just move on, get over it. Like, how? Because whenever I try to express myself, right? So let's say I stop wearing, braids or whatever. And then I get comments like, wow, you're very whitewashed. Okay, so what is okay? Am I allowed to wear my hair in braids and be, too Black? Or, if I wear my hair straight and I dye it blonde, or, whatever, I switch my code, that's a whole other thing, like code switching, then I'm whitewashed, right? And so it's a very, I feel like that's where the stress is added on, is that people are people of color are constantly gauging their environment and who they should be in that moment, right? What language should I speak here? What language and how, what's my tone of voice, and what code do I use at home? What code do I use at work? What code do I use with my girlfriends, right? And so people who are not, white people, they don't understand that in all the ways that people of color do. They might understand it in certain scenarios, right? Like people who grow up in very, very low income environments, they have a certain way of being there. And then when they go into areas where there's more affluence and financial privilege that way, they also have to switch code.
Yes.
Right? So in that sense, the experience can be similar. They understand what code switching is like, but it's not in their every single experience. If they're living in person of color living in a predominantly white area, which is my experience my whole life, I'm constantly having to think about that. And also my experience is very different from other people who are not mixed race like me. And I realize my experience is much different than someone who is, as I say it, all the way Black. It just is. Like my codes are very different than those of my aunts and cousins and all of that. So I recognize that as well. And so, it can be, who are we allowed to be? Who are we supposed to be? And when we do that, what's the backlash? What are the comments that we're going to receive? And then what do I do with that? Well,
what are some signs or symptoms of someone who has been racially traumatized?
Gosh. Well, when you asked that question, I immediately went to, is there a person of color that hasn't had some level of trauma experience? It doesn't have to be full-blown PTSD, right? It doesn't have to be that. You and I know that. But maybe not everyone knows that. And I think any sign of, if you're noticing that you are no longer doing the things that you love to do, or going to places that you love to go because you are tired of dealing with any sort of racist comments, or that uncomfortable, unsafe feeling you get, and so maybe you're isolating a little bit more. Maybe your relationships with your family, like there's just a lot of stress and tension, and there's not necessarily anything standing out to you in your relationship that's causing the problem.
Yeah.
And if you're noticing increased anxiety or depression, or an urge to use substances, sort of numb, or anything, right? Like we can numb on Netflix. Anything to sort of escape the stress or anxiety that you're feeling. Mm-hmm. It could be, right? It could be that it is a result of the minority stress that you're carrying, the stress that comes with being a minority, and having a lot of those paper cuts, those microaggressions. A lot of people of color, especially a lot of Black people, there's this idea and expectation that they have to be strong, right? I have to be a strong Black woman. I have to be a strong Black man. And if I admit or acknowledge that I'm feeling really super stressed out, tired, and overwhelmed from all the racist stuff I have to deal with every day, then that means I'm not strong. And I think in our Black communities, people are beginning to speak out against that and say, that is a load of crap, right? Like, no, that's another way to dehumanize us, right? We are allowed to feel stressed out. We are allowed to feel depressed. We are allowed to feel overwhelmed and traumatized by our experiences, right? Like people driving home and like just getting home as fast as they can, but also trying not to break any laws because they don't want to get pulled over by a police officer. I mean, stuff like that is very real. The conversations Black parents have with their Black kids are very different, right? White families typically don't have to prepare their kids in multiple ways of how to deal with law enforcement, how to deal with the education system, how to deal with the workforce, in terms of the color of their skin, right? Just because they are Black. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot that people of color and families of color have to do. Yeah. And a lot of that is overwhelming, and a lot of that is not supported. And we don't even talk about it with each other. I mean, at least in my experience, right? Like my Black family didn't talk about it with other Black families. Yeah. Right? And get that community support of like, oh my gosh, us too. Yeah, like let's help each other out. And I really hope that more Black families are helping each other now, and I think they are. I hope. But I think those are some of the signs. Like some of it can be the same as a veteran with PTSD, mm-hmm. or a survivor of sexual violence. It's similar types of symptoms. But if you're noticing anything that is causing you distress or overwhelm, and you think it's any related at all to the experiences of racism that you've had, reach out for support and help. And it can be daunting to figure out who, right? Because what if I find a white therapist? Are they really going to get it? And they're not. In some ways they just can't because they don't have your same experience. But there are some very, very awesome white therapists and therapists of all ethnicities who are aware and informed and will do their very, very best to align with you. And support you and not know, but still be there with you and figure it out with you. So,
Yeah. And I'd have to agree with, and take it a step further. And I feel like there's also some guardedness when you have race-related trauma, like you have to keep a wall up. It's like, it's me against them type of thing, or just mm-hmm. like you said, that anxiety or that fear about maybe going to work because you feel like they're going to be against you, or that they're going to use that against you. So there's that. And then there's, I've talked to a variety of women who have felt unclean,
mm-hmm.
because of the color of their skin, or
Yeah.
just because of the way that they were made to feel, and they grew up feeling that they were unclean or dirty, or there was something wrong
Hmm.
with the way that they looked because of certain features and things like that. So
Right.
some of that, yes. um, if you were to focus on African American women for a minute, uh,
Hmm.
what are some of the aggressions? Because that's what I am. That's that's what I hold near and dear to my heart, and I feel like that's something that's what you hold near and dear to your heart, to an identity that you hold.
Yeah.
Being a Black woman, what do you feel like Black women experience that no one else experiences in the realm of racial trauma?
Wow. That is a fabulous question and something really important to explore. Um, I think there's a lot of pressure to be the matriarch. Um, and what I mean by that is, Black women who are also mothers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and, they have to be the really strong, like, mama bear, right? And they also have to go out into the workforce, right, and do all the things for the most part, right? Like they do, because it's really expensive to live in America. um, I feel like the pressure of being everything that they need to be to stay safe and keep their kids safe. So sometimes that means, constantly having to switch code so that, they go from, they have to stay in their career and they have to keep their job and they have to keep the money coming in, right? Just, along with their partners. And I feel like a lot of the race-based stress that comes from being a Black woman is the pressure to be all of those things. And at least from the Black women that I've talked to and that I have in my life, and that is a huge pressure, because there's a lot of resources that Black women are not afforded. And so you have to work extra hard to get some of those resources. Or if they receive resources from, community or government, then they are really looked down on, being like, well, typical Black woman needing, how many kids do you have? Like, why don't you just stop having kids, right? And then if you can't afford them, stop having them. And how about go get a job while you're at it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's just horrible things that Black women hear. And then, the standards of beauty, right? Like, a lot of cosmetic companies don't offer makeup that actually works for Black skin tones. And, the clothing that is available is very, like, stereotypical. I don't know. Like, it's either like people are thinking, oh, well, you're Black and, so you want ghetto clothes. Like, and even when I say that, I'm like, what is that? Like, it's just so wrong. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like the pressure of being, like, holding up the standard of beauty of being, a Black woman, and then being a parent, and then being someone who is working and trying to make it, and then be the support for their husband if they have a husband, right? And I'm not even getting close to people who, Black women who are not cisgender, heterosexual, all of that. So that's a whole other layer, a whole other thing to talk about. But I think that from my experiences, that has been what is the most stressful and the most, racial trauma, is all the expectations and assumptions. And then dealing with also just, like, their roles, like who they are in their families. And that speaks a lot to the group aspect of cultural trauma, because having to deal with racism means that the group has to deal with it together. And there are rules and expectations and how you function as a family to deal with the racism in your world and in your family history. And that's to me a whole other really long exploration. But that's what I've seen as the most stressful.
Right. And it sounds like, just trying to balance being the pillar of strength with
Mm-hmm.
the whole kind of just get over it and do what you need to do mentality.
Right, right. Yeah. And you're held up to these standards that are completely unreachable,
Yeah.
right? Because then when you get there, then, you're accused of like, well, wow, you're whitewashed or,
Yes.
whatever it is. Mm-hmm.
Yes. What what how can we cope with this? How can we cope with race-based trauma? What are some resources that you suggest for our listeners that are going through this?
Yeah. I think first is to maybe do some self exploration. Like it could be a lot of people don't realize that the racism they experience could actually have this kind of impact on their mental health, or the health of their relationships. And so maybe just adopting an open mind, like maybe some of the stress you're experiencing is because of the racism and it's not, like something else, right? It could be that. Um, and then talking to your friends about it, the other, Black women or men or people in your life, and saying, hey, like I don't know if you have this experience, but I really noticed that when I do that, when I talk to my friends of color, it's just such a relief. I don't have to carry the burden all by myself anymore. And I'm validated and I don't feel like there's something wrong with me, right? Like there's something wrong with me that I can't deal with it. It's very, very validating to have those experiences. And as a lot of people of color, their cultures are very like group oriented, right? They're not individualistic. And so I think coming together as a community and getting involved within your community can be very, very helpful and kind of a protective factor or a resilience factor to help you kind of like, get back up. Like you get knocked down, get back up and bounce, like that bouncing back, right? And growing and through that and being aware of what's going on, really being connected to your community. So there are some organizations in most major cities, at least, where there are, community organizations and events for people of color, at least in Denver. I'm in the Denver area. So there are some groups where, you can get together. Like, for example, I have a friend and colleague who does dance. And they're empowering dances and they're for women of color. And they're amazing, right? These women get together and they dance. They learn the dances of their culture or other cultures, right? And they're just getting together, expressing, but they're coming there knowing that they're sort of dancing into or dancing off, all of the stress and the burden that comes with being a woman of color. So there are things out there that can be very low cost or free, right? Getting involved in your community, support groups, stuff like that. And if you really are noticing that's really impacting your life, or you really want to explore this in an intentional way, joining, maybe therapy support group or finding a therapist. And if you're a Black woman, there's a really cool therapist directory called Therapy for Black Girls. And so you can find a Black therapist or a therapist who's very, very, not just culturally aware, but good allies to us in our communities, and they're really good mental health therapists as well. So could be really helpful. So those are some of the resources. It doesn't always have to be therapy, is what I tell people. You don't always have to explore these things with a therapist, but for a lot of people, they find that really helpful. Do that, especially if it does feel like, this is like the trauma level, like it's really impacting me in that way. I feel like my fight or flight is always on. And I'm really avoiding my relationships, or there, a lot of things going on that are just feeling not right to me. Then it could be worth talking to some sort of helper or healer in your community, and see how that goes. So
Okay.
I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much. And I'll make sure to put that in the show notes. How can people get in touch with you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm on all the social media things that most people enjoy. You can find me on my website, which is revolutiontraumarecovery.com. And I'm also on Facebook, same thing, Revolution Trauma Recovery. And then Instagram at Revolutionized Life. And those are the main places I hang out on social media. So you can find me there. Yeah. So
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Robyn, for
thank you.
giving all this wealth of information to our listeners. And I'm so happy that you decided to come on and share your experiences and your wisdom with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was definitely an honor. I appreciate you and all the work that you're doing on this podcast and sharing such great stuff with everybody. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.